Racist cop orders Chuck Norris to kneel. Seconds later, regret hits like a brick. The sirens weren't on, but the lights were flashing, red and blue waves cutting through the night like warning signs no one wanted to read. They had him surrounded. 3 squad cars, 6 officers, 1 crowd, breathless and recording. And in the center of it all, Chuck Norris, on one knee, hands behind his head, silent. The cops standing over him, badge crooked, chest puffed with authority he hadn't earned, raised his voice louder for the onlookers than for the man at his feet. "You think you're above the law, old man." Chuck said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than the weight of the badge itself. The officer, Deputy Carl Renner, sneered. He was the type of man who smiled in the mirror but frowned at anyone who didn't look like him. His fingers twitched on his belt, brushing near his sidearm more than necessary. He didn't recognize Chuck. Not really. Not yet. But that would change. And it would change fast. The crowd watching wasn't cheering. They weren't jeering either. They were holding their breath. The moment felt off, wrong in a way you couldn't quite name. The man on the ground wasn't panicking, wasn't pleading. He was just there, calm, almost too calm. 2 hours earlier. Small town, southern sun, the kind that bakes the pavement and makes tempers short. Chuck had arrived without notice. He always did. An old pickup, dust-caked, pulled into the parking lot of a small diner called Dell's. No reservations. No destination. Just coffee. Maybe some peace. The moment he stepped through the door, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly, like a new weight had been added, and everyone instinctively straightened their posture. He ordered without speaking. A nod. Black coffee. Sat near the back. Watched. The town was quiet, but the tension wasn't. At the counter, a teenage boy, maybe 16, maybe 17, argued with the waitress. "I said no onions," he muttered. She apologized. "It's not a big deal," she added. "I'll fix it." But before she could grab the plate, the boy's father stepped in. "Deputy Renner, you trying to poison my kid?" His voice cut through the quiet like a whip. The waitress stepped back, startled. "No, sir, I oughta have you fired for that." Chuck looked up. No expression, just awareness. The deputy leaned in. Too close. Chuck quietly set his cup down. 30 minutes later, the deputy stood outside the diner, still fuming. The waitress had disappeared into the back. The boy, embarrassed but silent, leaned against the patrol car. That's when Chuck walked past. No words, no glance, but something about the way he moved, unbothered, still, struck a nerve. Renner called out, "Hey, you think ignoring a badge is smart?" Chuck didn't stop. I said stop. Chuck stopped, slowly turned. Their eyes met. The deputy stepped closer. Up in his face now. "What's your name?" Silence. "You deaf, old man." Still nothing. Chuck's gaze never left his. 10 minutes later, the cuffs were on. The backup was called. Renner wanted a show. He didn't know it yet, but he was writing the first chapter of a story he wouldn't live down for the rest of his life. Back in the present, Chuck still knelt on the pavement. A camera phone zoomed in. The video streamed live. The caption read, "Old man refuses to kneel for racist cop until he's forced." People were watching. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. The officer paced behind Chuck now, barking for the crowd. "Let this be a message. You challenge order, this is what happens." Someone in the crowd called out, "You don't even know who he is." The deputy snapped around. "He's nobody, just a stubborn, washed-up tough guy." The camera caught Chuck's profile. Calm eyes, stillness that didn't match the chaos. A little girl in the crowd clutched her mother's hand. "Mama, is that really him?" The mother didn't answer. She just watched, because in that second, it started to click. The walk, the silence, the weight in the air. This wasn't just any man. And the people who knew, they weren't laughing. They were waiting. The backup officer whispered to Renner, I think that's Chuck Norris." "What? Look at him. Look again." Renner scoffed. Walked up behind Chuck. "That true?" he asked, leaning in. "You some kind of legend or something?" No response. "Well, guess what legend? You're my town now. My rules." He reached for Chuck's shoulder. The crowd gasped. Chuck stood. Not quickly. Not aggressively. Just stood. One fluid motion. Unstoppable. Unbothered. And taller than anyone expected. His eyes locked with Renner's, and now the fear was in the officer's face. "I said," Renner began, but Chuck didn't let him finish. He stepped forward once, only once, and suddenly, every weapon in the area felt useless. Because there are some men you don't put on their knees, and if you try, you'd better be ready to kneel yourself. Chuck stares Renner down. The crowd falls completely silent. And the deputy? His hand twitches near his weapon. He's about to make the worst mistake of his life. 6 hours earlier, the sky was clear over Grayston, one of those small southern towns that looked like a postcard but felt like a warning. White picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, American flags hung with perfect symmetry. But the smiles didn't reach the eyes, and the whispers were louder than any truth spoken aloud. Chuck's truck rolled in unnoticed. No cameras, no headlines, no sound but the soft thump of tires on pavement. He wasn't here by chance. He never was. Grayston had made the news recently, once. A teenager, 17, black, name withheld, beaten during a traffic stop. The report said it was a misunderstanding. The footage said otherwise. No body cam, no consequence. And the officer? Deputy Carl Renner. Same one who now had Chuck kneeling on pavement just hours later. Chuck had seen the headline and the footage, then turned off his radio and started driving. Not to make a scene, not to start a fight, but to witness. And maybe, if the time was right, to finish what needed finishing. The town didn't know he'd arrived. They didn't see him pull into the gas station on Main, or walk into the diner with the faded red letters spelling Dells, or sit in the back booth with his coffee, black, no sugar, and his eyes scanning the room like he was cataloging the soul of the place. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble was always good at finding him. The waitress at Dell's was young, barely 20, blonde ponytail, nervous hands. Her name tag read Abby. Chuck watched her carefully, not in the way men watched women, but in the way soldiers watched the sky for signs of rain. She moved too quickly, apologized too often, and every time the bell over the door rang, her shoulders flinched like muscle memory. That told Chuck everything. At 1:17 p.m., the door opened and Renner walked in. He wasn't in uniform, but the way he walked said he didn't need to be. People nodded at him. Abby froze. She tried to smile. Chuck could see her trying. Renner sat at the counter. Didn't order. He just started talking, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "You know, I pull over 3 of them this week. None had plates. None had insurance." He laughed to himself. "And not one of them could look me in the eye." Abby placed a coffee in front of him, lips tight. "They afraid of the truth," he added, sipping without thanking her. Chuck didn't move, just listened. The room was tense, but used to it. This was the norm. A town that didn't rock the boat, even when the boat was sinking people. Renner eventually stood, tossed $1 on the counter, less than the price of the coffee, and turned to leave. But he didn't. He looked straight at Abby. "Don't mess up the order today. I ain't in the mood." Chuck watched as she nodded quickly, eyes down. And that's when he knew. This wasn't just a bad cop. This was a bully in a badge, with a town too scared or too used to him to speak up. Chuck took another sip and decided he wasn't leaving just yet. 2 hours later, Chuck saw it firsthand. The teen, same one from the news, was back in town, walking near the courthouse, hoodie on, head down. Renner spotted him from across the street. Didn't say anything at first, just followed. Chuck watched from a bench across the square. The cop circled like a wolf, then closed in. "You got ID?" Renner asked loudly. "I'm just walking home," the boy said. "You match a description." "Of what?" "Don't get smart." Chuck stood, crossed the street, didn't speak, just stood near, close enough to change the math. Renner looked up, eyes narrowed. "You again?" Chuck didn't answer. "You stalking me, or something?" Still silence. Renner's voice sharpened. "You got business here, or you just like watching folks that don't know you?" Chuck's gaze didn't waver. "You don't belong here, old man," Renner muttered, then walked off. But his shoulders were tighter now, because deep down, he felt it too. The shift, the weight, the consequence waiting. Chuck helped the kid get to the community center. Didn't say who he was. Didn't need to. The kid thanked him anyway. Called him sir. Chuck nodded once. Walked tall. Back at Dell's, the sun was starting to set. Chuck sat at the booth again. Abby brought him a refill. "Thanks," she whispered. Chuck looked at her, soft but serious. He ever hurt you? She hesitated, then shook her head. Too fast to be honest. I'm fine. You don't look fine. Her eyes welled, barely. Then she straightened, cleared her throat, and turned away. Chuck watched her walk back behind the counter. The way her shoulders sank when no one was watching. It was all the answer he needed. He didn't plan what happened next. Didn't draw it up. Didn't want it. But when Renner showed back up, badge on this time, and saw Chuck walking toward his truck, he saw it as a challenge, a threat to control. So he stepped in, hand on his belt, voice loud enough for every passerby. You think you're tough? Think you can come into my town and play sheriff? Chuck stopped, turned, and for the first time, he spoke. I think you're afraid. Renner's face twisted. Hands behind your head. You sure about that? On your knees. Now. Chuck held his eyes. Didn't blink. Then, he knelt. And just like that, the town gathered. Phones came out. The story started filming. Chuck on one knee, silent. Renner above him, drunk with power. And as the deputy placed his hand on his weapon, Chuck whispered 4 words. You're about to fall. The street was quiet, but not empty. Cars slowed. Doors opened. People stepped out with phones in their hands, eyes wide, unsure if they were witnessing an arrest or a reckoning. No one spoke above a whisper. They didn't need to. Chuck Norris was kneeling, and Deputy Carl Renner was shouting, You're under arrest for interfering with an officer. But the words fell hollow. No one clapped. No one nodded in agreement. The deputy's voice echoed off storefronts and faded fast, like smoke without fire. Chuck still hadn't moved. He knelt calmly on the pavement, hands behind his head. But somehow, even like this, he didn't look weak. He looked like a storm waiting to stand up. Inside Dell's diner, Abby watched from the window. Her hand trembled against the glass. Behind her, a few locals peeked out nervously, unsure of what they were allowed to feel. Because in a town like Grayston, silence was safer than truth. Until now, a reporter from a small local blog, the Grayston Voice, happened to be across the street. Her name was Dana. She'd covered softball games, ribbon cuttings, and pancake breakfasts. Never this. She didn't recognize Chuck Norris. Not yet, but something told her to start filming anyway. Get the sound, she whispered to her cameraman. Get every word. Renner turned to the crowd. This man disrespected an officer. He resisted lawful command. Chuck looked up just slightly. His eyes met Dana's lens, and something in her stomach flipped. That look? That wasn't fear. That was patience. At the edge of the sidewalk, a teen, the same one Chuck had protected earlier, pushed his hoodie back and pulled out his phone. Is that? He whispered. The screen lit up. Live streamed. Viewers rolled in fast. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. Hashtags were already forming. Back on the street, Renner was pacing now, his hand still near his weapon. Chuck watched, still as a statue. You think this is some kind of statement? Renner growled. You think people are going to see you kneeling and turn you into some kind of hero? Chuck's reply came without volume, but with weight. I didn't kneel for you. Renner flinched, just slightly. Then why? Chuck blinked slowly. To give you one last chance not to do something you'll never walk back from. The crowd stirred. Renner's face reddened. You threatening me? I'm warning you. A second deputy arrived. Younger. Nervous. He looked at Chuck, then at Renner. Sir, are you sure? Stay back. Renner snapped. I've got this. But the second deputy didn't draw his weapon. He just stood there, watching, because even he could see it now. Something was wrong, and it wasn't the man on the ground. In the crowd, a woman spoke. Quiet at first, but brave. That's Chuck Norris. Heads turned. Renner froze. No way. It is, someone else said. Look at him. Look at his face. The second deputy took a step back. Sir, I think you need to stop. He's bluffing. Renner barked, but his voice cracked. Chuck stood up, slowly, controlled. One fluid motion that didn't ask permission. And now he towered over the deputy. Hand still down. Not clenched. Not raised. Just ready. Renner drew his weapon. People screamed. Phones zoomed in. Chuck didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't blink. He just looked at the man in front of him. This is your moment, Chuck said quietly. What you do right now, it writes the rest of your life. You think I'm afraid of you? Renner spat. I think you're afraid of being seen. Dana, the reporter, stepped forward. Mic in hand. Deputy Renner. Are you arresting him? On what charge? Renner hesitated. You want to be famous? Chuck asked him softly. This is how it starts. The live stream viewer count hit 50,000. And climbing. Back in the diner, Abby whispered, Please just don't shoot. The teen lowered his phone slightly, watching with wide eyes. He'd never seen anyone face a badge like this. Not without shaking. Not without breaking. But Chuck just stood, unmoving, and the gun pointed at his chest began to tremble. Not from recoil, but from the hand holding it. Last chance, Chuck said. Renner's hand tightened, and then he dropped the gun. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The weapon clattered to the ground. Renner looked around, at the faces, the phones, the silence. He stepped back, hands shaking. This town is mine, he muttered. Not anymore, Dana said. At that moment, 3 unmarked black vehicles turned the corner. Federal. Serious. Too quiet to be local. They stopped at the edge of the scene. And from the passenger seat of the first SUV, a woman in a gray suit stepped out, badge in hand. She looked straight at Chuck, then at Renner, and said, without hesitation, We've been watching, and we're ready. The woman in the gray suit held up her badge. Department of Justice. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't guessing. She already knew. Deputy Carl Renner, she said, loud and clear. We're placing you under federal review for civil rights violations and unlawful use of force. The crowd gasped. Phones shook in hands. Someone whispered, Finally. Renner blinked, stunned. For the first time, he wasn't in control. His power, the false confidence, the years of unchecked behavior, all cracked in one breath. What are you talking about? He said, reaching for authority that wasn't there anymore. We've been watching you, she replied. Your record, your stops, your silence in reports. You should have stopped a long time ago. But now, she turned slightly. Now we got the whole country watching. The live stream viewer count passed 100,000. Chuck didn't move. He didn't need to. He had already shifted the world without lifting a finger. The second deputy, the young one who had stayed silent, stepped away from Renner and walked over to the DOJ agent. I want to talk, he said quietly. She nodded. Good. You'll have your chance. Inside Dell's, Abby collapsed into a booth and put her face in her hands. She wasn't crying out of sadness. She was crying because something had just broken, and for the first time, it wasn't her. Across the street, Dana, the reporter, was live on her blog stream now. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, voice shaking, this is no longer just a traffic stop gone wrong. This is the moment a small-town system gets pulled into the light. Behind her, Chuck stood calmly, watching it unfold. He didn't speak. He didn't pose. He just watched, the way you watch a fire you didn't start, but knew was coming. Renner looked around. People he used to scare were standing taller now. His son, the same boy who'd ordered pancakes hours ago, stood near the sidewalk, eyes full of shame. Chuck saw that look. He knew it too well. Don't be like him, Chuck said quietly to the boy. Be better. The boy nodded. Didn't say a word, but it was enough. At that moment, the unthinkable happened. The sheriff arrived. Big man. Wide brim hat. A limp from an old injury. He stepped out of his vehicle, saw the lights, the crowd, the agents, and then saw Chuck. And he froze. Because he knew. They'd served together once. Long ago. Different time. Different war. Chuck Norris, the sheriff said quietly. I'll be damned. Chuck gave a small nod. Still standing, he said. Always were, the sheriff replied. The sheriff looked over at Renner, now deflated, sweating, and pale. You embarrassed this badge. You embarrassed this town. You're not going to defend me? Renner said. You don't get defended. You get remembered. As a warning. The sheriff turned to the DOJ agents. Whatever you need from me, you got it. A murmur went through the crowd. Not fear. Not anger. Relief. Because the system hadn't just been exposed. It was folding in real time. One by one, townspeople began stepping forward. A mechanic. A teacher. A nurse. All sharing their stories. Small abuses. Silent threats. Moments that never made the paper, but lived in their bodies for years. The agents took notes. Dana kept filming. Chuck kept watching. Not judging. Just holding the space open so the truth could finally walk through the front door. Abby stepped outside, still shaking. But this time, she didn't hide. She walked to Chuck. "You didn't even say anything." "Didn't need to," he said. "You planned all this?" "No," he answered. "But I didn't stop it either." Renner was cuffed. Not because Chuck said so, but because the truth finally outweighed the badge. He was loaded into the back of the unmarked car. And for the first time, he looked small. Not because he'd been beaten, but because someone had finally told him no, and meant it. The sun dipped behind the rooftops. Chuck turned to the sheriff. "I'm not staying." "Didn't figure you would," the sheriff said. "But thank you." Chuck didn't respond. He just nodded once and started walking. Before Chuck reached his truck, a voice called out from the crowd. "Mr. Norris, there's another one." He turned slightly. Another who? Another like him. Another badge. Another town. Chuck looked back toward the horizon. The shadows were getting longer. Where? 3 counties over. Chuck opened the door to his truck, paused, and said quietly, "I'm not done yet." Chuck didn't leave town that night. He was halfway to the county line when he saw the headlights in his rear view. 4 cars, no sirens, no signals. Just quiet intent, like wolves pacing the edge of the tree line. He didn't pull over. He didn't need to. Instead, he drove off the road, down a narrow dirt trail, and let the truck idle by a stretch of pine where no streetlights reached. Then he waited. It didn't follow, because men like that, they don't follow when they're out of uniform. They regroup. They call. They whisper. And they try to clean up what they didn't expect to spill. Back in Grayston, the fallout had begun. The mayor, a man whose handshake came with a wink and a favor, was already on damage control. Statements were being drafted. Renner was labeled a lone actor. The usual language. The safe kind. The kind that doesn't admit rot, just unfortunate incidents. But it was too late. Chuck hadn't just exposed a deputy. He'd cracked the foundation. And now the town was choosing sides. Inside Dell's diner, Abby sat with a notepad. Dana, the reporter, interviewed her for a follow-up piece. Every so often, Abby would pause, look out the window, and whisper something like, "I didn't think it would actually change." But it hadn't, not fully. Because change doesn't come without resistance. The sheriff was the first to feel it. He received a call from the county commissioner. "You're making waves," the voice warned. Maybe they needed to be made. "You think the DOJ is going to babysit you forever?" "No," the sheriff replied. "But I think Chuck Norris is watching." That ended the conversation, but it didn't end the threats. The next day, Chuck drove into a neighboring county. He stopped for gas. The station attendant was nervous. "They said you might come through," he muttered. "They? Them. The ones who were playing clothes, but act like they wear badges." Chuck handed him a 50. "Keep the change." The kid nodded, then whispered, "Be careful. They're scared now. And scared people, they shoot first." At 10:42 a.m., 2 unmarked cars parked outside the town hall in Grayston. Inside, a meeting. Not public. Not friendly. 12 men. All older. All white. All connected to each other in ways that never made the news. One spoke. "He's just a man. We remind people of that. This ends." Another. "No, he's not just a man anymore. He's a myth now. And you can't shoot myths." "So what then?" A pause. Then one said what they were all thinking. "You can only bury them." Chuck knew they wouldn't come after him directly. Not yet. They tried to cut his legs out from under him. Discredit him. Spin the narrative. Make the world forget. But the problem? The world wasn't forgetting. In fact, it was sharing faster than it could be silenced. A clip of Chuck kneeling, then standing, had passed 5 million views. Someone overlaid it with music. Someone else called it the moment justice stood up. People weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. But the system wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That night, Abby's house was egged. Dana's car tires were slashed. A fire started in the trash bin behind the sheriff's office. No one claimed responsibility. No arrests were made. Chuck stood outside Dell's the next morning, watching the ash still drifting across the lot. Frank, the cook, handed him a black coffee. "Town's twitching." "They always do," Chuck said. "You sticking around?" "Not sure." Frank looked at him, then nodded slowly. "If you leave now, they'll think they won." Chuck didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. At noon, the sheriff received an envelope. No name. Inside was a photo of Chuck. crosshairs drawn over his face. Underneath it, a note. We let one badge fall. We won't let another. The sheriff locked his office door. Then called Chuck. You got eyes on you. I always do. This is different. No, Chuck said. This is just louder. At 5:17 p.m., Chuck stood in front of the same courthouse where the teen had once been stopped. He didn't carry a weapon. He carried the file, the one Dana had compiled with testimonies, photos, reports, things the town had buried. He handed it to the DOJ agent. You want proof? It's all in there. She took it. You're not afraid they'll come after you? Chuck looked up at the courthouse. They already did. That night, as he walked back to his truck, headlights flared behind him. Engines roared. 2 pickups cut him off in the street. Men jumped out. Faces masked. Voices loud. Time to go back to where you came from, hero. Chuck didn't run. Didn't flinch. He stood in the glow of the headlights, calm as ever. They approached. One on the pipe. Another a chain. A third reached into his coat. Chuck stepped forward. 1 step. They froze. He raised his voice for the first time in days. You came for a fight. Another step. But you forgot what happens when a fight comes for me. They looked at each other. Hesitation. Then, a siren. A real one. The sheriff's cruiser turned the corner, lights blazing. The trucks peeled off. Chuck watched them disappear into the dark. The sheriff stopped beside him. You okay? They weren't ready. They never are. Chuck opened his truck door. Inside, another envelope. No name. No stamp. Just one printed sentence on a sheet of paper. If you keep standing, we'll start taking others down. Chuck folded the paper, lit a match, watched it burn, and said to the wind, then you'd better be ready for what stands back up. The morning after the threat, Chuck was already moving. He didn't call the sheriff, didn't wait for agents. He walked down Main Street with a manila folder in one hand and a memory in the other. The folder held names, dates, details, a pattern of abuse stitched together by whispers, stories, and courage. And Chuck had gathered every thread. At 8 a.m. sharp, he walked into town hall. The receptionist blinked at him, startled. You need something? I need a room, he said calmly. With chairs and a microphone. She hesitated. For what? For the truth. The town had heard rumblings. The night before, someone had spotted Chuck at the old print shop. Dana, the reporter, had received a late-night email titled, You want to film this? And so, at 9 a.m., the first camera arrived. At 9:07, the sheriff walked in. By 9:15, Abby entered holding a printed photo of herself, a bruise barely healed, taken years ago. And at 9:20, the room was full. Chuck stood in front of them. No podium, no title, just presence. I don't give speeches, he said. I don't do press. He held up the folder. But if you're tired of pretending, I've got something worth hearing. He opened the file and started reading, case by case, person by person, each name followed by silence, each silence followed by faces lowering in shame. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He told the truth, unfiltered, unapologetic, undeniable. At the back of the room, Mayor Weller watched with clenched fists. His name hadn't come up yet, but everyone knew, because some silences are just as loud as crimes. Chuck closed the folder. You want to fix this town? It doesn't start with firing one man. It starts with looking in a mirror. Someone clapped, then someone else, then everyone. Not for Chuck, but for what had finally been said. The DOJ agent stepped forward. This is enough to open a full investigation. Not just local, she added. Statewide. We'll need more testimonies. Abby stood up. Then the teen Chuck had defended earlier. Then Dana. One by one, people stood, not trembling, not yelling, just standing. And suddenly, the system that had stood for so long began to sway. But Chuck wasn't done. There's one more stop I need to make. He walked across the street to a building with boarded windows. No sign, no records, but people knew it. A place where those in charge stored the things they didn't want seen. Inside, the basement was locked. Chuck didn't ask for a key. He pulled it off the wall and walked in. Dust, mold, silence. But in the back corner, a box. Inside, old police files, unshredded, unburied, and very real. He brought them out, handed them to the DOJ. Bury these, and you bury the town. Later that afternoon, as agents packed boxes into their trucks and townspeople lined the sidewalks watching, someone asked Chuck, "Why you? Why here?" Chuck looked at them. "Because someone has to go first." That night, Dana published the full story. Headline: "The Man Who Stood So We All Could." The clip of Chuck's quiet reading hit 12 million views in a day. By morning, other towns had come forward. Chuck hadn't just started a fire. He'd handed them a match. The sheriff approached him one last time. "We could use a man like you on the inside." Chuck shook his head. "I don't wear badges anymore." "Why not?" "Because sometimes justice needs to look like a stranger walking into town." As Chuck packed his truck, Abby walked over and handed him a cup of coffee. "Black. Just how you liked it. They'll tell stories about you." Chuck gave a half smile. "Let him. Where will you go now?" "Wherever the silence is too loud." As Chuck climbed into his truck and turned the key, a small envelope fell from the visor. No stamp. No name. Just 3 words, typed in block letters. "It's not over." He opened it. Inside, a photo. A young woman in another county, bruised, handcuffed, staring straight into the camera of a police body cam. Behind her, another man in uniform. The caption read, "Next." Chuck stared at it, put the truck in gear, and whispered to himself, "Then I'm on my way." 2 days later, Chuck's truck rolled into a new town. 1 road, 3 stop signs, a sheriff's office with bulletproof glass, and a courthouse that looked more like a converted church. The place didn't look dangerous. But Chuck had learned a long time ago, the prettiest towns often buried the darkest truths. And this town was hiding something. Someone. The girl from a photo. Her name was Marley Tate. 19. Arrested after recording a cop shoving her brother during a traffic stop. Charged with resisting. Spent 48 hours in lockup. Her file had already been deleted from public record. But Chuck had a copy. He didn't start at the courthouse. He started at the diner. Same as always. He took a booth. Black coffee. Eyes forward. In less than an hour, he had all the names he needed. Because when Chuck Norris walks into a small town, the truth starts whispering. The badge in question belonged to Deputy Ray Grimmell. 6'3", ex-military, proud of 2 things, his truck and his temper. Locals said he kept order. But Chuck knew better. Men like Grimmell don't keep peace. They enforce fear. At noon, Chuck walked straight into the sheriff's department. The front desk officer blinked twice. "Can I help you?" "Looking for Grimmell." "You have an appointment?" "He does." Grimmell wasn't in uniform, but he stood like a man used to getting his way. Thick neck, thicker arms, smirk that didn't move even when Chuck walked in. "You lost, old man." Chuck didn't answer. He laid the photo of Marley on the table between them. Grimmell glanced at it, then laughed. "She got what was coming. You don't pull phones on cops." "She didn't pull a phone," Chuck replied quietly. "She pulled the truth." Grimmell leaned forward. "You threatening me?" "No, I'm reminding you." Grimmell stood. So did Chuck. 2 statues in a room that felt suddenly too small. The front desk officer watched from behind glass, fingers hovering over the emergency line. "This isn't your town," Grimmell growled. "No," Chuck said, "but she's my problem." Grimmell scoffed. "You think you scare me?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. "No, I think she does." That night, Chuck met Marley. She was working at a gas station just off the highway. He didn't approach fast, didn't want to startle her. He just bought a bottle of water and waited. When the last customer left, he laid the photo on the counter. She froze. "How did you?" "Someone sent it to me." "Why?" "Because they knew I'd come." She looked at him, confused. Then something in her eyes softened. Recognition. Not of his name, but of what he was. "I didn't think anyone cared," she whispered. Chuck nodded. "They do now." By morning, the plan was in motion. Chuck didn't threaten, didn't break in. He simply showed up again and again. At the station, at the courthouse, at the mayor's office, holding the file. And as the town watched, as whispers turned to questions, Deputy Grimmell started unraveling. He barked at co-workers, snapped at reporters, pushed a teenager's phone to the ground. And Chuck, he just stood there, watching, not moving, until the town stopped moving with him. At 3:42 p.m., the mayor stepped in. A press conference. He called Grimmell a valued servant. Chuck showed up, stood off to the side, and handed Dana, who had driven in from Grayston, video footage. She played it. Live. Grimmel, in uniform, dragging Marley by the hair into a cell. No resistance. Just power. Abused. Live comments exploded. Viewers crossed 1.2 million. The mayor's mic went silent. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night, Grimmel ran. Tried to leave town. Unmarked car. No badge. But Chuck was already waiting at the county border. Standing. Calm. When Grimmel stepped out, fists clenched, Chuck didn't move. You ruined me, Grimmel spat. No, Chuck said. You did that yourself. Grimmel lunged. One swing. Missed. Chuck moved like wind. 2 strikes. Open palm. Elbow. Silence. Grimmel hit the dirt. Cuffed. By his own backup, who'd been watching the whole time. The next morning, Marley stood at the podium. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. This town protected the wrong people for too long. But yesterday, someone showed me something. That silence isn't strength. It's surrender. She looked at Chuck. He nodded once. That afternoon, the governor called for a full investigation. 5 resignations followed. 3 arrests. And a billboard went up at the edge of town. No name, just a silhouette. Hat, boots, and 3 words. He stood up. As Chuck walked to his truck, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. 1 word. Chicago. Underneath, a link. A video. A young man thrown to the ground outside a club. Cuffed. Punched. Onlookers screaming. Badge visible. Badge clean. Chuck stared at the screen, then put the truck in gear. One more stop. The sun was rising over a city Chuck didn't belong to. Chicago was bigger than Grayston. Louder than Marley's town. But the pain? The silence? The fear? It was exactly the same. The video that brought him here had already gone viral. A young black man, thrown against a car. Hands up. Face bruised. Laughter from the officer. A badge reflecting in the streetlights. No charges filed. The headline read, "Suspect resisted." But Chuck had seen the video. There was no resistance. Only survival. He didn't head for the police station first. He went to the club, the place where it happened. Graffiti on the wall. A poster for a DJ no one remembered. And candles. Lots of candles. Laid down by strangers who knew the feeling. Chuck stood in the morning light, staring at the names etched into the sidewalk. Not just the boy in the video, but others. Different cities. Same story. He kneeled. Not for show. Not for protest. But because some things deserved to be faced from the ground up. Inside a nearby coffee shop, Chuck met with the boy's sister. She didn't ask his name. She already knew. They said it was a mistake, she said. Said he looked like someone else. They always say that. She looked at him. You think anything changes? Only if someone stands when others sit. She nodded. You think you can fix this city? Chuck shook his head. Not by myself. But I don't need to. That afternoon, Chuck stood in front of the precinct. He didn't knock. Didn't shout. He waited. Until a captain stepped outside. Can I help you? Chuck handed over a USB drive. That's everything, he said. Names. Badges. Videos. How did you get this? Does it matter? The captain opened the file. Read the names. Closed it. We've had people come forward before. You've had noise, Chuck said. Now you have proof. You threatening my department? Chuck looked him in the eye. I'm giving you a choice. That night, the file hit the press. Leaked. Untraceable. The footage was raw. A pattern exposed. The mayor called for immediate suspension of 5 officers. The chief resigned. The public gathered. This time, they didn't chant. They didn't scream. They simply stood. Together. Still. And when Chuck appeared at the edge of the crowd, they didn't applaud. They nodded. Because legends don't need stages. They just need witnesses. 2 days later, the boy left the hospital. Bruised. Quiet. Chuck met him outside. You scared? He asked. Yeah. Good. Means you still care. The boy smiled. Just barely. They said you're not staying. I never stay. Why not? Chuck glanced at the horizon. Because there's always another silence to break. He got in his truck. Turned the key. But before he drove off, a little girl ran to the window. Marley's cousin. She held up a piece of paper. A drawing. Of him. Standing tall. A crowd behind him. A badge cracked in half. She pressed it to the glass. Chuck looked at it. Then at her. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, he smiled. A real one. Not wide. Not loud. Just enough. He gave a small salute, then rolled away. Back in Grayston, a new sheriff wore the badge. Abby opened her own diner. Marley started working with civil rights lawyers. And Dana? Her story landed her on national news. The headline? He doesn't speak for fame. He speaks when it matters. But Chuck was already gone. Already halfway to somewhere new. A highway. A horizon. A silence waiting to be broken. Because the legend of Chuck Norris isn't just about fists or fury. It's about the moment a man decides to stand, when no one else will. And nothing is louder than a man who says nothing but means everything. The end.